You wake to the sound of scratching at the door. Not the claws of a rat, not the squeal of a pig, but something softer, more insistent. Push the wooden door aside, and there it is, a dog. Not a guard dog, not a mangy stray, but a lapdog. Its fur brushed, its collar glinting, its eyes practically screaming, "I own this castle, actually." Welcome to the strange, delightful, and occasionally absurd world of medieval pets. They weren't just companions. They were status symbols, workers, confidants, and sometimes unintentional hazards. Lapdogs, tiny lions in silk collars. In the courts of nobility, small dogs were all the rage. Ladies carried them in their sleeves, tucked them into their beds, and spoiled them with scraps finer than what most peasants ever tasted. A medieval lapdog might have eaten poultry, venison, or broth-soaked bread, all while a peasant in the same village was gnawing on cabbage soup. These weren't mutts chasing pigs in the yard. These were pampered pooches with names, jewels, and sometimes even their own servants. Their job? Warmth, mostly. A tiny dog on your lap in a drafty castle was better than nothing. But also, they were conversation pieces, silent little accessories in a society obsessed with display. Still, owning one came with hazards. Medieval texts actually warn of lapdogs as jealous little tyrants. Some were said to bark, growl, or even snap at rivals who dared approach their mistress. Imagine preparing a courtly love poem for the lady of the castle only to be sabotaged by a tiny snarling fluff ball whose loyalty cannot be bought with verse. And then, of course, there's the noise. Imagine a great hall of stone echoing with important voices until someone's pampered dog explodes in barks at the sight of a servant carrying a chicken. Medieval life, dignified in theory, ridiculous in practice.
Cats, both loved and suspicious. Cats lived a double life. On one hand, they were indispensable mousers. Grain stores were everything, and without a cat or two prowling the corners, your winter bread could vanish into the bellies of rats. A good barn cat was worth more than a lazy farmhand. On the other hand, cats were suspicious, too aloof, too watchful, too independent. Their slitted eyes unnerved people. Their nighttime prowlings whispered of hidden knowledge. A noblewoman might stroke a sleek cat by the fire, praising its elegance. A peasant might swear the same cat was the devil in disguise, slinking through shadows to spy for witches. And yet, they appear constantly in medieval art, sometimes reverently, hunting mice with elegance, sometimes irreverently, doodled in the margins of manuscripts, doing, let's call it, less saintly activities. The monks, bless them, had a sense of humor. Medieval cats, in other words, didn't need your approval. They tolerated humans only so long as the food supply was steady. Some things never change.
Horses, the real aristocrats. If lapdogs were pampered, war horses were practically royalty. These animals were fed oats, beans, and carefully measured diets. Their stables were cleaner than most peasants' cottages. Groomed daily, shod with care, trained like athletes. These horses were the Ferrari, the battle tank, and the insurance policy of the medieval world. And their owners? Nobles sometimes wrote about their horses with more affection than their wives. Chronicles detail steeds by name, praising their loyalty, strength, and courage. Knights might ride into battle singing hymns, but it was the horse that carried them through mud, chaos, and blood. Without a good steed, a knight was just a man in heavy armor, one stumble away from being speared. For peasants watching from the sidelines, it must have been infuriating. That horse eats beans while I'm lucky to have bread.
Ferrets, monkeys, and other odd companions. Beyond cats, dogs, and horses, the Middle Ages dabbled in stranger pets. Ferrets were kept for rabbit hunting. Slim, slinky assassins trained to chase prey down burrows. Nobles carried them around in pouches like furry daggers. And then there were monkeys. Imported through long-distance trade, these tiny creatures were kept chained in noble households as symbols of wealth. They were dressed in little outfits, taught tricks, and sometimes depicted in paintings, tugging at ladies' veils or stealing fruit. But monkeys were unpredictable. Charming one moment, biting the next. A noble who bragged about owning one might soon discover that exotic prestige came with scratches, shrieks, and the occasional theft of his dinner roll.
You hear it before you see it, a piercing cry, sharp and echoing over the fields. Then the shadow, wide wings sweeping across the sky. A falcon, tethered by a thin leather strap to its master's gloved arm, feathers ruffled, eyes burning with the intensity of a creature that knows it was born to kill. This isn't just a bird. This is medieval status, strapped and hooded, ready to fly. Falconry wasn't just a hobby, it was the hobby. Nobles across Europe spent absurd sums importing falcons and hawks from as far away as Iceland and the Middle East. A trained bird of prey wasn't just entertainment, it was a living luxury item. If a lapdog was a silk scarf, a falcon was a diamond necklace. There were strict rules, too. Manuals carefully dictated which bird was appropriate for each rank. Emperors deserved eagles, kings got gerfalcons, dukes and counts had peregrines, ladies had merlins, priests had sparrowhawks. Heaven forbid you were a low-ranking knight flaunting a bird above your station. That wasn't just arrogance, it was social treason. The gear, medieval pet fashion, but deadlier. Falcons didn't just sit around naked. They were outfitted with gear that would make a modern pet boutique blush. Leather hoods with delicate stitching kept their eyes covered until the dramatic reveal. Jesses, thin leather straps tied to their legs, were cut and dyed with care. Bells were attached to their ankles so owners could hear them even when they vanished into the sky. And when the bird returned, imagine the scene. Talons slamming into a padded glove, feathers bristling, the noble smiling smugly at the onlookers while a servant hurried over with a bit of raw meat as reward. This wasn't just sport, it was theater. Picture this, a noble woman in a garden. She strolls slowly, her gown trailing in the grass. On her hand, a tiny merlin falcon perches, hooded and quiet. Suddenly, she slips off the hood. The bird's head jerks, eyes wide, scanning. A sparrow flutters from the hedge. In a flash, the merlin is gone, wings slicing the air. The lady's hand suddenly light. A few heartbeats later, it's back, prey clutched in talons.
The noblewoman laughs softly, stroking its feathers. Meanwhile, a passing peasant looks on, thinking, "That bird eats better than I do." Exotic birds, the bright, the loud, and the questionably useful. Falcons were prized, but nobles didn't stop there. Exotic birds arrived through trade routes. Peacocks from India, parrots from Africa, even ostriches, if you were really ambitious. Peacocks strutted through castle gardens, their tails dazzling in the sun. They were the ultimate lawn ornaments, loud, arrogant, and undeniably expensive. Parrots, as we saw with the bishop, added comic relief. They repeated phrases, sometimes shocking ones, especially if trained by mischievous servants. Imagine your solemn court ceremony suddenly interrupted by a squawked obscenity from the rafters. And ostriches? They were mostly for show. No knight ever saddled one for battle, but wealthy collectors liked to boast of owning a bird so large it could kill a man with a single kick, which, frankly, is a terrible thing to own in a courtyard.
Birds weren't just pets, they were metaphors. To the medieval mind, every animal carried symbolic weight. Falcons symbolized nobility, dominance, and divine order, the high soaring bird closest to God. Parrots represented exotic wonder, but also vanity, bright feathers, loud mouths, not much depth. Even the humbled pigeon could stand in for peace, or, more practically, a tasty pie filling. Artists painted them, poets praised them, nobles flaunted them. Birds were living metaphors perched right on your wrist.
Imagine the great hall at Christmas, tables groaning under food, candles sputtering, the fire roaring, and then silence. Servants enter carrying the centerpiece, a whole roasted peacock, feathers carefully reattached so it looks alive, its neck painted gold, its eyes glittering with glass beads. Gasps ripple through the hall. Children gape. Nobles nod approvingly. The bird is set before the lord of the castle, who slices it with ceremony. Did it taste good? Not particularly, but that wasn't the point. It was spectacle.
You're in a drafty hall, straw scattered across the stone floor. A hound sleeps by the fire. A cat stretches lazily in the corner. All is calm until you notice a nobleman reach into his cloak pocket, pull out something long and furry, and set it loose across the table. Not a rat, not a snake, a ferret. The animal slinks between trenchers of bread, knocks over a wooden cup, then disappears up a servant's sleeve, causing shrieks of laughter. Welcome to the other side of medieval pet keeping. The eccentric, the dangerous, the downright unhinged.
Ferrets weren't just novelty pets. They were workers, valued for their ability to hunt rabbits. Trained ferrets were slipped into burrows where they darted through tunnels, driving terrified rabbits out into waiting nets. Nobles adored them, not only as practical hunting aids, but also as fashionable curiosities. Imagine dangling a ferret from your belt like a furry dagger, ready to pull it out to impress guests. Oh, this? Just my rabbit assassin. And like all medieval animals, ferrets ended up in art. Marginalia shows them darting at rabbits or sometimes simply being cuddled, their sinuous little bodies coiling in ways no cat or dog ever could. But there's a catch. Ferrets smell badly. Keeping one indoors was a commitment, one that only the wealthy and the reckless could romanticize. Dancing bears, the tragic side of entertainment. Now, Imagine a village square. Children crowd around, villagers murmur, and into the circle lumbers a bear. Its fur is ragged, its movements unnatural. A chain is fastened to its muzzle. A man with a stick jerks it forward. The bear rises awkwardly on its hind legs, sways to the sound of a drum, and the crowd cheers. Dancing bears were part of medieval entertainment, hauled from town to town. They weren't pets in the cozy sense, but they were owned, controlled, and displayed. For the peasants who rarely saw wild animals up close, the sight was mesmerizing. For the bear, it was misery, thinly disguised as amusement. And yet, in the warped logic of medieval society, owning such a creature was proof of daring. A lord with a bear in his menagerie wasn't seen as cruel, he was seen as powerful.
Monkeys, tiny court jesters with teeth. Then there were monkeys. Imported through long, expensive trade routes, these exotic creatures often turned up in noble households. Paintings show them wearing collars, sometimes even tiny outfits. They perched on windowsills, tugged at women's veils, or snatched fruit from tables. But behind the novelty was chaos. Monkeys were unpredictable, clever enough to amuse, vicious enough to maul. A noblewoman might giggle as her pet clung to her gown until it decided to bite her finger. In manuscripts, artists loved using monkeys as symbols of vice. They were drawn drinking wine, stealing food, even engaging in bawdy activities best left undescribed here. To medieval minds, monkeys were the mirror of human folly. Our bad habits shrunk down and covered in fur. Picture this, a feast in a drafty hall. Nobles sit around the table, dogs lurking beneath for scraps. Then the earl, grinning with pride, gestures to the servants. They bring in his pet bear. It lumbers forward, heavy paws scraping on the rushes. The hall erupts with laughter as it clumsily paws at a honeycomb, sticky sweetness clinging to its muzzle. Everyone claps, impressed at the display. Only the servants exchange nervous looks, knowing that if the chain slipped, the entertainment would end very differently. Squirrels, rabbits, and pocket-sized prestige. Not every unusual pet was terrifying. Some nobles favored squirrels, kept on delicate chains, scampering across their owner's arms. Others raised tame rabbits, soft and docile, the medieval equivalent of a fluffy showpiece. Marginalia often depicts rabbits armed with swords or riding snails, suggesting that even monks found something hilarious about giving these timid creatures imaginary bravado. Of course, if you were poor, your pet rabbit was probably tomorrow's dinner. But for the wealthy, a tame bunny in the garden was a whimsical little luxury. The prestige of strange pets. Here's the heart of it. Unusual animals weren't really about companionship. They were about spectacle. To own a ferret, a monkey, or a chained bear was to say, "Look at me! Look what I can control, what I can afford, what I can tame." Whether in the banquet hall or the market square, these animals weren't just pets. They were status statements, strange little emblems of wealth and power.
It's one thing to own a medieval pet. It's another to live with one. For every illuminated manuscript showing a lady with a dainty lapdog, there were the less glamorous realities. Fleas, overturned food bowls, and the occasional disaster involving a cat, a candle, and a very flammable tapestry. Let's peek behind the gilded margins. Feeding time. Who eats what? Meals were never equal in the Middle Ages, and this applied to pets as well. Noble pets ate like kings. Lapdogs dined on venison scraps, pigeon meat, or broth-soaked bread, sometimes even carried to their mouths by hand. Horses feasted on oats and beans more expensive than a peasant's dinner. Falcons were fed carefully portioned bits of raw meat, served with the pomp of a chef unveiling a roast. Peasant pets, if you could call them that, lived on whatever they could scavenge. A village dog might eat stale crusts, fish guts, or the occasional unfortunate chicken if no one was looking. Cats survived on vermin, or went hungry with everyone else. Exotics were trickier. Parrots demanded fruit. Monkeys pilfered from the kitchen. Bears required huge amounts of food, often bread, milk, and honey, turning them into very expensive novelties. In short, your pet's diet told everyone exactly how rich you were.
Where did pets sleep? Everywhere. Noble ladies tucked lapdogs into their beds for warmth. Yes, in the same sheets. Falcons sometimes perched on stands beside their owners, hoods pulled down like feathered nightcaps. Cats claimed whatever corner they pleased, from the hearth to the altar rail. In monasteries, monks often complained about cats sprawled across manuscripts, smudging ink with their paws. One famous manuscript still has an ink blot shaped like a cat's paw print, history's first feline signature. Horses, meanwhile, had stables often cleaner than peasant homes. Straw was changed daily. Grooms brushed their coats, and the animals slept in stalls fit for nobility. And peasants? Their dogs and cats curled up in the dirt alongside them, fleas and all. Cozy, but itchy. Mischief, medieval chaos in fur and feather. Pets, of course, didn't care about human dignity. They brought chaos wherever they went. Dogs snatched meat off banquet tables, cats knocked over oil lamps, parrots squawked obscenities at the wrong moment. Ferrets escaped their pouches mid-feast, sending guests scrambling. In manuscripts, artists gleefully captured this truth. Cats shown stealing fish, dogs caught gnawing on loaves, monkeys gleefully mocking priests. Pets were the slapstick comedy of daily life. And chaos could turn deadly. A single candle tipped by a cat could set rushes ablaze. A startled horse might trample a servant. A monkey loose in the pantry could ruin a feast for 50. Pets had no sense of occasion. Picture this, a castle feast in full swing. Nobles gossip, servants hurry. Music echoes through the hall. Then it happens. A cat leaps onto the high table, snatches a pheasant wing, and darts off. Laughter erupts, except from the cook, who turns pale. Moments later, the dog follows suit, bolting after the cat, sending trenchers clattering to the floor. A falcon, startled by the commotion, bursts from its perch, wings beating wildly, scattering candles. Suddenly, the feast is chaos. Nobles ducking, servants chasing animals, flames licking at the tablecloth. Somewhere in the fray, a parrot shrieks what sounds suspiciously like, "Fools!" Dinner, in other words, is ruined. Disasters of a different kind. Sometimes pets cause disasters not by mischief, but by existence. Disease. Fleas on dogs and cats could spread plague. Monkeys could transmit strange fevers. Even horses brought parasites into human spaces. Bites and scratches. Exotic pets were dangerous. Bears mauled handlers, monkeys bit fingers. Even lapdogs were reported snapping at suitors. Jealousy. More than one chronicle hints that nobles sometimes favored their animals over their families, feeding pets while wives and children went hungry, a scandal waiting to happen. Pets were beloved, yes, but they were also risks, living, breathing hazards wrapped in fur and feathers.
To the medieval mind, animals weren't just animals. They were walking, meowing, braying metaphors. Pets carried spiritual weight, symbolic meaning, and a dose of superstition
that could shape their owner's reputation or doom them entirely. Cats were the most contradictory of all pets. In some places, they were celebrated as guardians of grain stores, champions against the eternal enemy, rats. Monasteries quietly kept cats despite the occasional complaint, because without them, the monk's bread was doomed. Cats also slipped into art as symbols of domesticity and watchfulness. But the cat also carried a darker reputation. Their slitted eyes and night-wandering ways made people suspicious. By the 13th century, cats were tangled in folklore as witches' companions, demonic spies, or creatures of bad luck. Black cats especially were seen as ominous. The irony? The very animal that kept plague-carrying rats in check was accused of bringing the devil into the home.
Dogs fared far better in the symbolism sweepstakes. Faithful, obedient, and brave, they became metaphors for loyalty in literature and art. In illuminated manuscripts, a dog curled at a woman's feet often signified fidelity. In romances, knights with hounds at their side carried an aura of trustworthiness. Of course, in real life, dogs stole food and chewed shoes like any pet, but symbolically, they were near saints. There's even a touch of theological allegory. Christ as the Good Shepherd, his followers compared to loyal hounds. To be called a dog in the right context could be a compliment. In the wrong context, well, it was an insult of the foulest sort. Birds, carriers of messages and mysteries. Pet birds filled manuscripts with color and medieval minds with metaphor. A falcon symbolized nobility, dominance, and the control of nature, fitting since falconry was a pastime of kings. A dove meant peace and purity, tying straight back to biblical symbolism. Even parrots, exotic and rare, were seen as semi-miraculous for their ability to mimic human speech. But symbolism could shift with context. A bird in a woman's hand might mean purity, or, depending on how it was painted, sexual temptation. Birds were metaphors as fickle as their flight. If the dog symbolized loyalty, the horse symbolized power. Knights were measured not only by their armor, but by the quality of their steed. War horses embodied courage and prestige, while a noblewoman painted with a palfrey, a gentle riding horse, suggested refinement and grace. Some chronicles even suggest horses had souls, or at least something close enough to one. When a knight's horse died, it was sometimes mourned in near human terms. Horses weren't just tools of war. They were extensions of their master's identity. Exotic pets, omens, and oddities. Monkeys, lions, leopards, even pet bears. These weren't just eccentric indulgences. They were potent symbols. A monkey might symbolize sin, chaos, or humanity's baser instincts. In manuscripts, they appear as thieves, or drunks, or troublemakers, a kind of medieval cartoon character warning against folly. Lions were royal authority incarnate. To own one, or even depict one, was a declaration of power. Bears could symbolize both ferocity and foolishness. The line between awe and comedy was thin. Exotic pets carried not only prestige, but a whiff of danger, like the owner was tempting fate by bringing the wild into their household. Perhaps the best glimpse of medieval pet symbolism comes not in lofty sermons or knightly romances, but in the doodles of manuscripts. In margins, cats chase mice, dogs harass cats, monkeys steal everything. These weren't mere decorations. They were jokes, satire,
and commentary. The monks drawing them knew the messy reality of animals. While the main text might drone about theology, the margins admitted that life was full of fur, fleas, and foolishness. Pets weren't just pets. They were metaphors, moral lessons, and comedic relief.
You might think a pet is just a warm lap on a cold night, a source of amusement, or a way to keep mice away from your flower. But in the Middle Ages, animals could become pawns in love affairs, witnesses in political games, and sometimes casualties of war. They weren't always innocent bystanders. Sometimes they were woven right into the story of human ambition. Pets in love, symbols of affection and jealousy. Picture a courtly love scene. A lady receives not flowers, but a puppy. Yes, giving a dog was a medieval love language. Dogs symbolized loyalty, devotion, and fidelity. Knights might gift a lapdog to a lady as a promise of service, or as a way of saying, "Think of me whenever it curls at your feet." Romantic, if you ignore the fleas. But pets could also sabotage love. Jealous little lapdogs were notorious for growling at suitors. Some romances even note women preferring the comfort of their dogs to the clumsy advances of knights. Imagine traveling for weeks, composing a ballad in flawless verse, only to be upstaged by a fluffy creature who won't share its mistress's attention. And cats? They didn't care either way. Curling in a lover's lap, they provided warmth and an excuse for intimacy. Yet if the cat bolted at an inopportune moment, it could ruin the mood with an omen of doom. Love was fickle enough without a cat deciding your fate. In one 14th century wedding account, a small dog was reportedly trained to trot down the aisle carrying the marriage ring on a ribbon tied around its neck. The hall erupted in laughter, delight, and a fair amount of chaos when the dog decided halfway through to sprint off towards the buffet. Romance meet reality.
Pets in war, companions and casualties. The battlefield wasn't free of animals, far from it. War horses were already aristocrats in armor, trained to trample, bite, and kick with precision. Their importance was obvious. But there were also dogs in war. Mastiffs and hounds were sometimes used in sieges, unleashed against enemies or guarding camps at night. Their senses made them invaluable, though the risks were brutal. One chronicler describes a mastiff who stood guard over its fallen master's body for hours, attacking anyone who approached. The dog became a legend of loyalty, remembered more vividly than the knight himself. And cats? Some accounts, though hazy, suggest besieging armies occasionally flung cats and birds over city walls, sometimes alive, sometimes dead, coated in pitch and fire to spread fear or flames. The horror is undeniable, but so is the bizarre creativity of medieval siege tactics. Political pets, gifts, bribes, and power plays. Animals could cross borders where people could not. A king might gift a rare animal to seal an alliance. Dogs, hawks, and falcons were especially prized. Imagine the prestige of receiving a bird that could only be trained by the nobility of another kingdom. It wasn't just a pet, it was a diplomatic handshake. In 1251, Henry III of England famously received a polar bear from Norway. Kept in the Tower of London, it was chained but allowed to swim and fish in the Thames, a spectacle that screamed, "Look at my international clout!" More subtle gifts included hunting dogs, which often doubled as long-term favors. To gift a greyhound was to say, "Our friendship will run swift and true," but everyone knew it also came with strings attached. Imagine two courts in tense negotiations. The nobles sit stiffly, words measured, tempers restrained. Then, from the lap of one visiting dignitary, a monkey leaps onto the table, scattering parchments, upending ink, and gnawing on a diplomatic seal. The room erupts in chaos, the treaty half smeared, half eaten. Did this happen? Perhaps not exactly, but monkeys were notorious troublemakers, and there are stories of them embarrassing their owners at crucial moments. A pet could sabotage politics more effectively than any spy.
Pets as witnesses to power. Beyond the battlefield and the banquet, pets linger in the background of medieval chronicles. They appear at coronations, funerals, and feasts. They're painted at the feet of queens, carved into the margins of official documents, even sculpted into tomb effigies. Take the effigy of Lady Margaret, Countess of Lennox, where a small dog rests at her feet. It wasn't just a decoration, it was a claim. That dog declared her fidelity, her noble status, her humanity. In death, as in life, her pet testified to her virtue. The politics of neglect. But sometimes, pets became too visible. Chroniclers occasionally mocked nobles who doted on pets while neglecting their duties. A king distracted by his hounds might be painted as unfit to govern. A queen more attentive to her lapdogs than her children might draw scandalous whispers. In a society where image was everything, even the way you treated your pets could build or break your reputation. Pets were never neutral. They carried love letters in the form of symbolism, fought on battlefields as furry allies, crossed borders as political ambassadors, and sometimes ruined everything with a well-timed bark, squawk, or leap.
Not every medieval pet lounged on embroidered cushions or nibbled sugared almonds from a golden dish. Most animals weren't luxuries at all. They were necessities. For peasants, a pet had to earn its keep. You didn't feed an animal just for company when you yourself were surviving on thin pottage and yesterday's bread. If something four-legged, feathered, or braying lived in your yard, it had a job to do. The peasant's dog. Forget jeweled collars and silken sleeves. The peasant's dog was likely shaggy, underfed, and perpetually covered in mud. Its main duty? Guarding. These dogs weren't meant to look cute by the fire. They barked at strangers, herded sheep, and if needed, defended the cottage from thieves. Chronicles occasionally mention them lunging at wolves in the dead of night, their barks carrying across frost-covered fields. But there was affection, too. A peasant child might sneak a crust of bread under the table for the family dog, or curl up beside it for warmth in winter. The dog might not have been spoiled, but it was still family. Cats in the barn. The noble's cat might be stroked like a sleek ornament. The peasant's cat? It was tolerated. A barn cat kept the grain safe from rats and mice. That was its payment. No one was cooking fish specially for it, but it got scraps when scraps were available. Still, bonds formed. Archaeologists have found tiny collars and bell fragments in village sites, proof that even the humblest families sometimes claimed a cat as theirs. You can almost imagine a barefoot child chasing a tabby around the yard laughing, while the adults shook their heads and muttered about wasting good milk on the devil's creature.
Now, here's an underrated medieval security system: geese. Peasants kept them not just for eggs and meat,
but for their temper. Geese are territorial, loud, and terrifying when riled. Intruders sneaking into a farm at night risked setting off a chorus of furious honking and a well-aimed bite from a beak that feels like a clamp. In Roman times, geese were credited with saving the city from invaders. In the Middle Ages, they performed the same role, only now they were also dinner when winter grew too long. Loyal guardians, delicious meals. Truly the multitaskers of the barnyard. Among the poor, donkeys weren't pets in the noble sense. They were beasts of burden. They carried firewood, pulled carts, and trudged endlessly through mud and rain. But they also became companions of sorts. Their stubbornness was legendary, but so was their endurance. Peasant families leaned on them for survival, and in return, donkeys often lingered around the homestead long after work was done, braying like eccentric relatives. Medieval proverbs praised their humility and mocked their stubbornness. Children gave them nicknames. Monks too admired them, painting donkeys into nativity scenes as symbols of patience and quiet faith. Picture this: a grim tax collector arriving at a peasant's cottage. He steps across the yard, ready to tally the pigs and seize a share of the grain. But before he even reaches the door, the geese spot him. They erupt into honking fury, wings flapping, beaks striking like tiny hammers. The taxman stumbles back, tripping in the mud, cursing as feathers fly. From the doorway, the peasant shrugs innocently. Oh, they don't like strangers. Some pets protected your home. Others protected your wallet. Mourning in fur and feather. It's easy to imagine medieval people as hardened by life. Death everywhere, plagues and wars, families losing children before they could even walk. But even in that grim reality, the loss of a pet could wound deeply. There are accounts of monks grieving the deaths of their cats. One Irish monk in the 9th century wrote a little poem for his white cat, Pangor Bon. In it, he compared their lives, the cat hunting mice, the monk hunting knowledge. When Pangor died, he wrote with such quiet sadness that you can almost feel the paw prints on his heart. Not all mournings were so literary. Sometimes it was just a child crying over a lamb that had died too young, or a knight pausing by the grave of his hound before heading to war. Pet burials. Graves among the gardens. Excavations across Europe have uncovered tiny graves, not just of livestock, but of animals buried carefully, as though they were family. Dogs wrapped in cloth, cats tucked into corners of gardens, even a pet raven laid to rest beneath a stone. One remarkable find: in the 13th century London, archaeologists unearthed a small dog buried near the foundations of a townhouse. It wasn't tossed aside as waste. It had its own grave, dug with care. That suggests love, even in a city crowded with noise and dirt. Peasants likely had fewer chances for such rituals, but scraps of folklore hint that even they might bury a beloved hound in a corner of the field, quietly, without ceremony, but with sincerity.
Do pets have souls? Here's where medieval thought gets complicated. The church taught that animals had no immortal souls. They were God's creatures, yes, but not candidates for salvation. They lived, they died, and that was it. And yet, when you read the writings of certain monks, you sense hesitation. Some quietly wondered if animals might have a place in paradise. If a dog could be so loyal, a cat so clever, a falcon so noble, surely God wouldn't let them vanish into nothingness. Theologians debated it. St. Thomas Aquinas himself argued that animals did not have rational souls.
But even he admitted that animals reflected the divine order, their existence hinting at something greater. Meanwhile, ordinary people probably ignored theology and hoped for reunion. A knight might whisper a prayer for his horse. A child might imagine their dog bounding across heaven's fields. Even in the Middle Ages, love had a way of bending doctrine. Picture a small chapel in France, late at night. A nun kneels, praying for her departed sisters. But tucked in the corner, almost sheepish, burns another candle. Not for a saint, not for a soul officially recognized, but for the convent's cat who had died that week. Was it allowed? Probably not. Was it human? Absolutely.
Close your eyes, and you can almost hear them. The whinny of a warhorse in a field, the hiss of a cat darting after a mouse in a granary, the high-pitched yap of a lapdog too spoiled for its own good, the clatter of geese announcing some poor peddler's arrival long before the guard did. The Middle Ages were not silent, not solemn. They were noisy, unruly, alive with fur and feathers and hooves. We often picture medieval life as a grim parade of plagues and battles, but pets remind us of something softer. There were companions in drafty castles, workers in muddy fields, distractions in cloisters, and troublemakers in banquet halls. They ate better than peasants, they starred in manuscripts, they guarded treasures, they warmed beds, they comforted the lonely. They were loved, sometimes too much, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes dangerously. And when they died, people wept, buried them, even wondered if they'd meet again in paradise.
In a world where life was harsh, short, and uncertain, pets carved out a little space for joy. A reminder that even in centuries of swords and sermons, humans still paused to scratch a dog's ears, laugh at a parrot's joke, or watch a cat stalk shadows across the floor. The Middle Ages are long gone, but the paw prints remain. Not just in graves or poems or dusty chronicles, but in the way we still talk to our animals today, the way we still feed them scraps finer than our own meals, or tuck them into our beds, or half believe that yes, maybe, just maybe, heaven has room for them too. And perhaps if you listen hard enough, you can still hear it. The scratch at the door. Soft. Insistent. A reminder that history isn't only written in battles and kings, but also in the quiet wagging tail of a dog who thought it owned the castle.